Super. All right, now you can call it to order.
Okay, we're going to call this task force meeting to order. And let's see, we have a handful of people in the Zoom room, and there was a raised hand. I suppose
I don't see any more.
Looks like that hand is down. Okay. All right, well, let's go on to our agenda, which was posted on Friday. It's going to be, I think, a relatively brief meeting this time. We're really not diving into the objective of this task force today. We've been called by the Board of Supervisors to provide input on early activation, so that's the reason we're holding this meeting today. We can go over a rough outline of what we can expect in the future with future meetings as well. And we are going to start with introductions and a welcome. Welcome, everyone. And we will go on to housekeeping details and organizational norms. We're going to start that discussion. We're going to focus a lot more on that in the next meeting. And then we will look into the main objective of today's meeting, consideration of request from Board of Supervisors for recommendations of amendments to the Cannabis Early Activation Regulations.
Actually, if we could switch 3 and 2.
Yeah,
right
we
after
can.
Introductions, we're going to want to just
jump right into it. Yeah, that sounds good. And then we will follow up by setting the next meeting date, and then we will be adjourned. So, for introductions and welcomes, hello everyone. My name is Andrew Amelong. I am currently the Cannabis Program Manager, which is why I'm here facilitating this, since cannabis is the main focus for Article 73. And I've been with Lake County since June of last year. I came on as an associate planner, and then in January I was reassigned to the program manager position. And I'll pass it on to Maria.
Maria Turner, Deputy Director for Community Development. I am here to support staff.
My name is Rebecca Harper. I'm the Executive Director of the Lake County Farm Bureau.
I'm Jan Carpenter. I'm a resident of the Kelseyville Cobb area.
Catherine Vanderwall, the Lake County Agricultural Commissioner.
Nicole Johnson, County Council Deputy.
Will Weiss. I'm a vineyard manager in Lake County, and I'm a resident of Lakeport.
Great.
Okay, let's see if we can get some of the people in the Zoom room.
Yeah, if the members of the task unmute you.
I did.
And we'll wait for Sarah to unmute somebody.
Cool.
Looks like we've got Nara Delbaca, who told us that she would be attending virtually, and we have Jennifer Smith. Anybody else with raised hands? No, I don't see any.
That would just leave Robert Geary, who was unable to attend today.
Okie doke. Well, we're going to keep moving on until Sarah unmutes, and then we can jump back to Nara and Jennifer so they can just introduce themselves.
Can they hear? Are you muted?
They raised their hand in
Oh, I see.
response to my saying so. So yeah,
She unmuted me, I think, or
Whoa.
someone unmuted me.
super.
Now we can hear you.
Hi there, Nara Dalbach. I'm a resident of Hidden Valley Lake.
Great. And we'll give
Hi there.
Jennifer.
Jennifer Smith, president of the Lake County Cannabis Alliance.
Super.
Okay, and our final member is Robert Geary. He's from the Habimital Pomo of Upper Lake, and he will be our tribal representative. He is traveling at the moment, but we touched base on these issues last week, and he's reviewing them, so. All right, now let's just go ahead and go straight into the third item. We'll come back to number 2, the consideration of request from Board of Supervisors for recommendations of amendments to the Cannabis Early Activation Regulations. And the reason we have Nicole Johnson here to, I guess, maybe give a summary of what we're looking at and what's expected of the task force concerning this issue.
As far as what's expected of the task force, the board has already given direction on that. So,
Well, what was really useful that we thought we'd have Nicole join us in the beginning is to sort of apprise us of the issues that County Council has had with early activation permits specific to cannabis thus far. That'll help us going forward because it kind of puts like the delineation on our wiggle room as far as what we want to recommend for amendments.
okay, so The issues here are largely based in what laws are triggered and what laws apply to land use in this instance, land use and environmental protection. The county ordinance offers under 27.4 and then a companion portion in the ordinance section that deals with cannabis, the option of an early activation permit. The early activation permit is separate from the use permit. You must apply for both because one of the elements of the early activation permit to qualify for that is to have a use permit in process to qualify at the outset for an early activation of use, is the way it's written now. But there are criteria, but they are separate permits. They are both analyzed individually and independently of each other. They both must satisfy both the county as well as the state. And depending on the project that's being applied for, federal laws that apply to the project. Early activation permits have a 6-month life. They cannot be longer than that, and there is nothing in the ordinance itself that allows a second or more permit to be issued under early activation section to an individual project. The issues that have been coming up are that they have been in conflict with each other. You'll have an individual apply for a use permit, and they'll apply for an early activation permit at the same time as required if you want one. And those, because they apply for it at the same time, and they are often applied to the same, if not a similar project, the confusion that comes up is that they are the same, that they are a step. One is a step in the process of the other, and that is not true. Under the ordinance, they are separate permits. They trigger the same rules that must be applied to them individually. So if CEQA, for example, the environmental regulation rules, is triggered by a discretionary project, then it's triggered by both the early activation permit and the use permit, which means in order to process an early activation permit, you must satisfy CEQA, which means that you must go through the same expensive process if you want the entire project that you're applying for both permits. CEQA has a few criteria in there where if you've already done the analysis for the project, that you might be able to use it again, but there are processes and criteria which could add time, which could add cost to this. So you end up with a situation where either you're adding extra time for a 6-month permit because of a CEQA analysis, or you find an exemption that applies to that early activation use permit. But by definition, under CEQA, an exemption means that the person applying for the use permit, for the early activation permit, cannot do the activities that they want to do under that early activation permit. So if you're applying to trench, dig, install, do any disturbances, anything that would put you outside of the exception for a CEQA evaluation, then you'd have to go through a negative declaration or an EIR evaluation for a 6-month permit for early activation. So so that caused a bit of confusion because they were parallel processed, because one requires the other to have been applied for, because they are for the same project. It was assumed that the same analysis can apply to both. But in order to do that, they have to be processed at the same time and they have to be approved at the same time, which means it doesn't benefit you to have an early activation of use permit in relation to, say, cannabis projects or any project. In fact, I hate to say cannabis, although that's what the purpose of this particular task force is. Any project, because early activation is not a permit that applied to just cannabis. It was a permit that applied to anything that was applied, any use that was applied for under the zoning ordinance, as long as you met the criteria. It is not an option. Our ordinance, no matter what language is used, cannot waive state law, and CEQA is state law. And state law requires that if you trigger CEQA, CEQA must be met. It needs to be processed under those rules. So in order to avoid CEQA assessment, you need to fit into an exemption or have your project not apply at all, which runs contrary to what people are asking for under the early activation use permit. And if they want those activities under the early activation use permit, then they have to go through the CEQA evaluation, which is the same CEQA evaluation they have to go through for the use permit, depending on, or a more complex process for the use permit, because they would have already done some CEQA evaluation prior which triggers addenda or reevaluation under certain code sections for CEQA. So they run contrary to each other, or they conflict with each other, or they're duplicative of each other. So they're not a benefit they're not as much of a benefit as many have interpreted to be under state law. And we cannot avoid it. CEQA is not something that can be avoided. We have to meet the criteria there. So those are the conflicts we've been having, is that to make the early activation use work, you have to meet CEQA. So either you don't do the project that you want under early activation that allows you to do the activities you want under early activation, or you do the CEQA evaluation and you're either doing it at the same time as the use permit, which doesn't benefit you at all, or you're duplicating it and doing the process twice. And those are the issues.
Why was early activation put in place in the first place? What was the point behind it?
I have no idea. It's
I was there.
Oh, you were there, 96?
Yes. Not when it was, well, I was there when it started getting applied to cannabis. Before, we didn't have to worry about cannabis.
I do know why it was applied to cannabis.
Mhm.
I don't know why the actual early activation section 27.4 was adopted in 96. I have no idea what its purpose was and what it was intended to do. It reads very much like an emergency permit provision, like the Coastal Commission has emergency permit provisions where, if there's something you immediately must have done. For cannabis, my understanding it was applied because there were conflicts in timing at the state level versus the county level for permitting and licensing. And the state needed something from the county and the county needed something from the state. So this filled in that role where you could get county approval that allows you to apply for the state approval, which allowed you again to finish your county criteria, meet your county criteria for the use permit. My understanding is that's less of an issue now, but I'd leave that to staff to explain what that process is.
So is it correct to believe it was put in place to try to help people get on board quicker, but it didn't work? And so
Well, no, what it did was, my understanding for cannabis application at least, it was applied it was intended to be applied in a manner that allowed for a non-CEQA triggering decision, meaning simply notification to the state that says, yes, you are on track at the county level to get the permit that you need, or not, the permit that you need at the county level. And then the state could act with the county's assurance and issue a license, and therefore you're not taking any actions, you're not doing any of the activities that would trigger CEQA evaluation, you're not doing any of that. You're just getting approval, or you're just getting some sort of, I hate to use the word certification, but some kind of reference from the county to the state that says, yes, you will meet the state, or you're on the track to meet the county's requirements, which is necessary for a state permit. But because the process, people wanted to parallel the process for both applications, and then they'd run into a hurdle where one would need the other. So this was deployed, this section, my understanding was this section was deployed so that there wasn't that hurdle, to at least iron out that hurdle a little bit for cannabis applicants.
It was also promoted by the Board of Supervisors as a way to support people who had been cultivating in compliance with Article 72 prior to that. And that's why you had to get your Article 72 certification in order to qualify for early activation. And I think that the goal there was for ground that was already disturbed or things like that.
been growing already.
Yeah, right. And but it got a lot bigger than Article 72. And it became untenable in the department, because then we're swamped with dual permitting applications for every single one, which is just overwhelming for the staff resources that we had.
I will say though, that as it stands right now, if it were applied today, and as it's been from the start, my advice has always been to look at 27.4 and part E as in elephant. That part alone should have eliminated a number of early activation permits.
27.4.
E.
The environmental
Yes.
impacts, yeah.
And while it says may, the language here is permissive. I said earlier that the county ordinance cannot waive state law, and state law is not permissive. If you have an environmental impact, you must go through CEQA. So while it may not require the denial of an early activation permit, what I said earlier, the only two options after that, if you go through with the early activation permit, is you're applying for a 6-month permit to take an activity that would require a full CEQA analysis that you're going to do anyway for the use permit.
So for those of you following at home, 27.4, you can go to the Lake County website, go up to, I think it's government. Let me do it again. Yeah, go up to government and click on boards. No, wait, sorry.
Do you want to just screen share that if that's a possibility?
It's my own iPad that I brought down just for backup. But you can go on to just the Lake County website and our main page. Come on.
Could she possibly screen share it up there since she's controlling?
Maybe.
Potentially.
Zoom? And
Sarah?
she can
Yay,
hear us
Sarah.
right now?
Can you walk
I can
us
just
through the
read it.
website?
But that way they could see it, I mean, as opposed
Yep.
to trying to follow along with.
Well, let's have Nicole read it first so we can just move along and we can do an internet tracking lesson in a little bit if we need to, so that everybody can find it.
Okay, so I'm not going to read the whole section, and I'm not going to read the intro part, I'll just read E. E says that the planning division may deny an application for an early activation permit for early activation of use if the use may result in adverse environmental impacts or if the use is currently being operated in violation of this chapter. I don't know how they got around the second half of that sentence for cannabis for prior use projects, but except for the fact that it is permissive. However, CEQA is not. So while the department may deny an early activation permit if it has environmental impacts, you're not required to deny an early activation use permit. It is not beneficial to an applicant who has to do both an early activation and a use permit to apply for an early activation permit when there are environmental impacts or likely to be environmental impacts, because CEQA will need to be met. And it's not beneficial to do it twice. A better process would be if one is looking for a quicker, I guess, so to speak, more guaranteed permitting is minor use permits. So if there are things related to the project that can be evaluated, and this runs into the CEQA addendum and reevaluation and piecemealing, and so it has to be done very carefully, but an early activation permit is just 6 months. It's intended for temporary, it's intended for not very big things. A minor use permit would be a full-blown use permit on its own for a smaller portion, or so you get, for example, you'd apply for a smaller part of your project and then apply for a major use permit for the full-blown project, and then you could get through potentially the analysis for the smaller project sooner than the full-blown major use permit. But that would be an assessment that an applicant would have to make on their own as to whether or not that would be cost effective. And again, you're still running into the problem of 2 CEQA evaluations. But with the minor use permit, the individual would have a full permit with an extended life expectancy that could allow them to operate longer than 6 months, years potentially, depending on the use permit, while they work through the potentially bigger issues related to a bigger project.
So in terms of amendments to the code, that we'd have to establish criteria differentiating what would count as a minor and what would be too large.
Yes.
Okay.
So parameters for any project. So and you can reach out to other municipalities to see how they're handling this, how they're breaking up their cannabis projects and how they're defining them. But yes, there would need to be parameters for the use. And every use in the ordinance has parameters. It says for anything of this size or anything with this many of this thing. If you look at wineries, for example, they do it by case. You could have a small winery for so many thousands of cases or less, and then above that is medium winery, and then between those two, between that range and the top of the medium is anything above that is large winery, right? And then there are different criteria that apply to each level of winery, but they each have a use permit and they each have a particular kind of use permit to apply. Like you could probably apply for a minor use permit depending on the ordinance you're looking at in the county you're in for the small production, or it may be a use by right. For example, there are some counties where a certain amount of winery production under so many thousands of cases is a use by right, but anything over that requires a permit.
Okay.
But parameters are definitely necessary for a use, otherwise a person would have no understanding of what use is being permitted.
So if we completely eliminated early activation, who would it affect? Who would be hurt by that, or would anyone? Because if no one would, that would be the easiest
I honestly
solution.
don't think anybody would be hurt by it.
Yeah, there's been a moratorium on early activation since last year. There are no early activation permits issued
I
this
know
year.
early on, when everybody was chomping at the bits and the county wasn't getting it together, I could see why it was put in place, but now it's been in place, and if somebody wanted to get in the game, they should get in the game the right way, so.
That's
yeah.
kind of what I've been telling applicants, and having early activation in place over these past few years is a large contribution to our backlog of projects, because it takes time and resources from staff to process early activation rather than process their full use permit. And then it's up in 6 months. There have been some who have been issued early activation multiple years, which I think Nicole questioned. And
Oh,
again,
I'm not questioning.
okay,
I don't know if there were,
there were,
but the early activation permit by
Whether or
operation
not.
of law is 6 months.
yes, and then it
So
would
some guy
expire,
that
then the
didn't
next
follow
year they
through?
would come, whether that was, that's what's been in place. Furthermore, a lot of times these, like we mentioned, it was parallel with the state licensing program. The state had provisional licenses, which they are phasing out. In fact, this is the last year for provisional licenses, and moving on forward, they're just going to be issuing annual licenses. So, I mean, this process of working out early activation at the county level is similar to what's happening at the state level.
So are there any other, like, I guess, development projects or something that's non-cannabis that apply for early activation?
Right.
Because you don't want to,
Yes,
you don't want to totally eliminate early activation, right?
Yes.
that's the idea, is to totally eliminate
Okay.
early activation.
Just for cannabis though, right, or for the
No,
whole?
for
For
all
everything.
uses.
Okay.
So what are some of these other uses? Like,
Yeah.
there must be
I
some example, I don't need a laundry list, but just like, there must be
Early
some.
activation can apply to any use. And if you are applying for a use permit under this code section, I'll read it to you. Notwithstanding the provisions of section 21-27.10 pertaining to uses generally permitted with a use permit, and those uses listed as permitted subject to first obtaining either a minor or major use permit in each zoning district, the planning division may issue an early activation permit allowing for the immediate activation of any use requiring a minor use permit or a major use permit, subject to the following conditions. So it's permissible. The planning division may issue an early activation permit allowing the immediate activation of any use requiring a major or minor use permit, as long as it meets the conditions. And the conditions are where the hurdle comes in. State law cannot be waived no matter what this ordinance says. So CEQA needs to be met. CEQA must be satisfied. It's a state law, it's a requirement. This county has to apply it. The county is the lead agency. And if there is an environmental impact, it triggers CEQA. This is a discretionary permit. It's not a ministerial permit. It's not statutorily exempt. And cannabis is not a statutorily exempt project.
But it would be smoother than for projects that we anticipated a categorical exemption or a statutory exemption. So,
Not necessarily, because this is a 6-month permit.
right.
So the use would end by operation of law in 6 months.
Well,
So when I was here way back, when God was a boy, we did just offer them they were recognized short-term permits because we anticipated their projects being done in that time period. But they were not very common at all. So they
Yeah.
didn't start getting common until
One
this
situation,
application.
let's say you're opening a resort and the summer season was coming up, you've gone through the initial study, you've gone through review and the analysis, you're expecting to be approved, but let's say planning commission's booked up for a while, and that might be a place where someone might, recommend pursuing early activation, but it's still, one of the biggest risks about it is all based on an assumption. It's assuming you are gonna get approved at planning commission, and we just can't make that assumption. There's new information is constantly showing up for just about any kind of project. So in that sense, it puts the applicants at risk, moving forward, putting the investment, starting to, pursue that project under the assumption that you're going to be approved, and we can't guarantee that approval. So it's,
If you do get an early activation permit, then you are by definition approved for that use for that 6-month period.
correct.
Full stop. The problem is many of the uses that are currently applied for that have been the subject of recent early activation permits are uses that are a massive amount of investment for a long-term use. And that is not appropriate for an early activation permit. And to apply for one on the assumption that you will have the use permit approved is erroneous. The use permit, you could get to the planning commission, everybody could tell you, hey, projects like this have gone before, there's no indication that it's gonna fail, that it's gonna be denied, you're gonna have, you're gonna be great, it'll be fabulous. Everybody could be massively positive and get to the planning commission, and two or three of them could determine that they can't make the mandatory findings in order to approve the permit. And you don't know, and you can't know. And to take action before that final decision by the decision maker, and then rely on that as if it were done already, is the risk is something that is a risk the applicant takes. It's not, no matter what the county does, no matter what staff does or what they say, that's a risk the applicant takes. And an early activation of use permit, when applied to long-term extreme investments and projects that that are planned for years, is a risk, because it is 6 months. Once that 6 months ends, you are in violation of the county ordinance. And you cannot get a use permit if you're in violation of the county ordinance. so it's the 51.4 is the section, and that's a mandatory finding that says you can't be in violation of any of the a series of ordinance sections, including the zoning ordinance. And if that finding cannot be made, if you are actually in violation, then you cannot get the use permit. So in that sense, an early activation of use could put you at risk if it gives you false impressions that you can continue a use when you in fact cannot.
Is it possible to take early activation out of the marijuana ordinance but not touch the main county ordinance? Because I would hate to cut off, even if it's one or two economic advantages that could happen in this county of early activation. I mean,
It could be, yes.
If it's rarely used, but there are times it might be handy.
It's possible language exempting cannabis projects could potentially, I mean, I'd have to see the language and I'd have to see.
Because the very next section on that code section says early activation is not permitted for those uses listed in section blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can exclude certain permits from certain kinds of uses.
Okay, let's see
Do we have any
if we have,
comments?
if I don't see any hands raised from our virtual viewers or attendees. There we go. I'll let Sarah do the unmuting.
Hi, this is Jennifer Smith. As an industry, we understand the need to probably sunset this practice in cannabis. My perception has long been that this was done for those that were compliant farmers to have provided continuity of business. Those that had been compliant under Article 27 and were moving through the process. One of the things that is essential as we move forward through this ordinance rewrite or new version, whatever we're going to end up doing, is that we're asking for a mechanism that allows us to have a tentative local compliance authorization so that we can start the state process, because the state process is very lengthy. And I think that early activation initially was that mechanism to let the farmers start that state process. And while I understand it has become burdensome on the county, I would like to find, if we are going to get rid of this early activation, I'd like to find a mechanism so that we can concurrently apply to both the county and the state at the same time.
Sure, okay, Nicole's got a question for you, Jennifer.
Sure.
So how is that handled? Because as far as I'm aware, Lake County is the only county in existence that has this kind of permit. How is that state county disparity handled in other counties for cannabis?
I do farm in another county, so I can give you a reference point. Calaveras County, once we pass the original conditions, which are all the land use conditions that the county has put into their ordinance, we are given a conditional letter of authorization that we can submit to the state. And while the state conducts its application process, the county is finishing up its application process so that we're able to concurrently apply. It does not give us permission to plant or operate. It gives us permission to apply.
Thank you. We'll go on to the next hand raised. Sarah?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Ariel from the Record B newspaper. I just have a couple questions. One has to do not with the topic at hand. Well, with the topic is I may have missed Nicole's last name. What is the lady's who gave the presentation? What is her full name and title?
Johnson.
That's Nicole Johnson.
And is she a task force member?
I am not.
Okay.
She's with county council.
County. And then my other question was, it's great that this is on Zoom, but I couldn't find an agenda for this meeting anywhere online. Where can the public find it for future reference? Because I went online, I couldn't find. I had somebody send me the agenda.
That is a great question. We are working with IT to be able to load the links onto the community development page. So we'll have that up and ready in time before our next meeting. But thank you for asking that question. You're not alone in having a challenge finding it this time.
Well, I'm just asking about the agenda because I assume the link is out there somewhere, maybe not. But
You can let them know. It's posted here.
Yeah, it is posted in the hard copy too, Ariel, if you're in the courthouse, if you want to stop by. We did have the hard copy posted.
got you. Thank you.
Thanks. Next caller or next hand raised, Sarah?
Hi, are you waiting for me?
Yes, go right ahead.
Thank you so much. This is Bart Levinson. I have a question about the unique position that Lake County is in with our shortage of staffing and the way that joins with the task of allowing or discontinuing early activation, and the importance of all of us understanding that here in Lake County, we have to do what the staff is actually able to support, which might be different from other counties. And I'm wondering, Maria, if that's something that you could speak to. How do we regard something like this early activation and the way in which it is either realistic or unrealistic for the staff to be able to carry out the required steps?
Thanks, Bart. Today, the task force is focused on amending the early activation for the reasons that were already stated by the Board of Supervisors. So we are still, which I don't think included staff resources, did it?
I don't.
Staff time.
But I don't think so. I don't recall hearing that.
Yeah, but it is something that we think about whenever we're looking towards such a robust number of applications is the delay in time, just because we only have so many planners for so much hours in the day. So, but thank you for that comment. We appreciate it. We'll go on to call in user 1. And also, just so everyone knows, when we're done, when we're done asking questions for Nicole, we'll let her go back to the office so that we can go on and talk about recommendations in our task force. Thanks. Looks like we got Nara.
Oh.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Angela, resident of Clear Lake Oaks, and I was calling, so regarding the early activation, I really like Jennifer's idea of just having a letter that the process is going through with the county for them to give to the state. One problem with the early activation is it doesn't give residents or neighbors a chance for public comment. And so the next thing, one day you just find out that there's a grow that went in with no input from residents. And, they're not able to comment on it, voice their opinion. But so I would agree with Jennifer in that a letter would probably be a better way to go than to offer early activation. And thank you guys.
Thank you. What, did you say your name was Ursula?
Angela.
Angela.
Angela Amaral.
Did you get that?
Amaral. I know her.
Oh, cool. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we have Nara.
Hi. Yeah. So I second pretty much everything that Jennifer said. The early activation isn't in line with state law at this point, but there are mechanisms that other counties have done where there are long wait times to a CUP. So like Monterey County, I think, is one where people have been, they have a kind of crazy bottleneck in their ordinance. And so people have been getting something like a letter so that they can do the state application. And because it was provisional, I'm not sure exactly how Monterey County is now doing this with annual only, but I do know that in the past they were issuing letters so that people could start operating and the county could start collecting the taxes, because we were looking at like 3 to 5 years, sometimes even wait times before people were getting their CUP. So that's another county where there's they created the bottleneck in their own ordinance. And I think, realized that they weren't going to get their tax money. So I do think that having some kind of mechanism to allow the process to move in parallel is going to be really important.
Thank you. Did we have any remaining questions for County Council before Nicole leaves? I don't see any. Thank you very much.
Enjoy your discussion. Have a nice week.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so with that said, I think we've covered everything on early activation. We need to go to the Planning Commission next, I believe, with what our recommendation would be.
Exactly.
But let's see, I guess we did hand out some material to the people here. I can email the other task force members following this meeting with some background reading on it. Should we, I think, allow some time and some reflection on this issue before coming to a final recommendation?
Well, if we can achieve consensus today, that would be ideal, because we have to generate a memo for the Planning Commission that has to be posted soon. Today would be great if we could post that too. We're making new timelines now for the Planning Commission and the public for notice public hearings. All of our materials for our agenda items are supposed to be available to them 10 days ahead of the meeting. And so we're working toward having that available then for the Planning Commission as well, 10 days prior to the hearing. So that sometimes they get big agenda packets. And so this will give them time without having to give up their weekends, in the future. So we'll be working on this memorandum for the Planning Commission if we can achieve consensus today.
Well, I would be comfortable moving to just remove early activation from the cannabis ordinance, leaving the other one as it is until we know if it needs to. I mean, I don't think we ought to be changing that until we know who's using it and what it's used for. But this wouldn't affect anything. It'd make it simple and just do away with it because it's not compatible with state law. And I think it was offered as a benefit that didn't turn out to be a benefit. So it's good to just revoke it.
Is there anyone that has a different viewpoint? And would you be comfortable with making a recommendation to the board that staff look for options regarding what Jennifer and Nara were supporting? Is that letter that would allow simultaneous application to the state without authorizing cultivation activities at that time? Is everybody here? Yeah.
Well, I have a question that's sort of a tangent, separate. So why don't you finish your thought?
Okay, so let's see if we can get consensus on that one thing. Was there anyone who wasn't comfortable with that as a recommendation?
Asking the Board of Supervisors to direct staff to sort of run out other options, including a letter of authorization that could be used with the state for those application purposes. But then I also think there's merit to, although I don't know if I understand, this was going to be my question. Jennifer was her name, I believe, the county council who just left? right?
Nicole.
Oh, sorry, Nicole, thank you.
Yeah.
Nicole, thank you. So Nicole mentioned that a minor use or she had another term.
Minor use permit.
A minor use permit would be another option, right? Or something like that. So is there any other sort of halfway that can be achieved? Is that something that staff can be directed to run out? I don't mean to complicate it, but
Not at all.
are there more options than simply this letter idea? And/or would such an option be onerous for county staff to try and comply with or deal with? Yeah. Okay,
so we could modify the recommendation to the board to include removing or rescission of the early activation provisions pertaining to cannabis. So that would be in Article 27 point something for cannabis. But to investigate options for either a letter or some sort of mechanism that allows for A, simultaneous application to the state, and B, a shortened time frame for processing, even if it just be a portion of the project. Is that about kind of where we are? Jennifer, what do you think? Are you nodding? That sounds about right? Okay, good thing I recorded it, so I'll remember what I just said. And then Nara, I think you're our other task force member. You have a thumbs up? I like her picture, by the way.
Thanks. Yeah, that sounds good. It's just we want to continue to make it easier for folks to move through the process. So.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else somebody wanted to add?
I haven't heard from.
Are we missing somebody from the task force?
Apart from the gentleman who's not able to attend, I can't recall his name.
Robert.
Oh, Robert Geary.
Robert Geary, thank you. No.
Okay. Did anybody from the public? Looks like Ariel has something to say. Let's go ahead and unmute Ariel, please, Sarah. We will try to get this method speeded up. Hey, Ariel, you there?
He's not unmuted yet.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. It occurred to me that I forgot to ask, I put it on the chat though, so the task force knows how many permits are pending now that they need to process.
Beats me.
How many permits?
Yeah, how many permits are pending for cannabis?
For cannabis right now, I believe there's currently, well, we had 3 approved, but one of them.
I'm not sure. Would you like me to transfer you to Eric Porter?
I think we're at about 128 permits pending.
Wow.
Yes. We have 100 of them, well, now 114 approved projects.
And so are those gonna be grandfathered into, I mean, like,
Well,
I guess that's how it works. They
those-
submitted under early activation, right?
They submit it, well, like Nicole said, you have to submit for a use permit, and these are just use permits.
Okay,
So these are not early activation permits. We
Okay.
currently have no active early activation permits. They all expired last year,
okay.
so.
So if then the letter thing comes about, then these permits could essentially, like, if they meet the
Pending, yes.
qualifications to proceed, a letter can be drafted for them to be issued to the state.
Yes, I believe we could reach that point when we wrap up the CEQA review process.
So I have a question.
Possible. I'm on a Zoom and having a really hard time. They keep talking to me to unmute people and they're staring at me again.
Okay,
That's Sarah.
that was Sarah, yes.
Okay, Sarah, one moment. We've got Rebecca, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we got Rebecca, and then we're gonna unmute call in user 1.
Okay.
Yeah, so my question is just that, I know Nicole mentioned with a minor use permit, there's, I mean, and never ending life with that, right? So that's not a she's saying that's not a provisional permit, as opposed to if somebody was applying for an early activation permit, that was provisional, and in order to continue with their operation, they have to meet other guidelines. So, I mean, is there any concern with that as opposed to providing the letter and then still moving through with the permitting process, or just having a minor use permit and then moving on?
Well, for both the minor use permit and major use permit, they have 10 years to the permit for cannabis.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of a solution, but it's, when you still apply for a minor use permit, you have to go through the permitting process. Really, the difference between a minor and a major is just how big are you going? You know, so a lot of minor use permits are also, you know, I mean, they're fairly significant projects. They just don't reach a threshold in size that would trigger the major use permit. So you still have to go through the application process. You have to submit a complete application. You need to go out for agency review and tribal notification. Then environmental review can be determined, and you go through the CEQA process, usually an initial study. It's still a similar process. You just go to the zoning administrator instead of the planning commission for approval.
Right, I guess I'm just not seeing the benefit in doing that. In addition, so if there's a larger operation, I guess I just don't see the benefit in having a minor use permit for a portion of your operation and then you still have this dual permitting process on staff. Like, I just don't think that maybe is the most efficient solution to this particular problem.
And the minor and major use permits are in the same queue. So it's not like it would speed up the process too much.
I guess I would just maybe not have that be something that is considered.
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, if the goal is to eliminate the dual permitting burden on county staff, there is a problem with these other options. You know, asking county staff to run out another option. I mean, right? I don't know. I don't mean to suggest this opposite of what I just said a second ago, but I mean, no, but that's an interesting point. That, you know, how are you going to reduce the backlog or the burden on the county, if not to streamline this into one approval, right? The problem is the multiple approvals, no matter how you hash it, whether it's size or time, apparently.
Yeah, it would not really impact any of the current pending projects that we have. They're submitted the way they are and we're processing them accordingly. It could be good advice for people in the future, you know, maybe start with a minor use permit and but then in a sense another issue is that you're getting into a phased development project, which can trigger an EIR. So it might be
Which takes you from the $1,000 initial study to the $150,000 EIR. Let's unmute call in user 1 and then we'll go back to Nara.
Thank you. This is Angela Amaral again. Just not exactly addressing the early activation, but just for future agendas, will there be a portion in the future agendas for public input? There wasn't one on this one. Is there a plan to have public input period?
We didn't say, let's open it for public input, but we have been taking Ariel and pretty much anybody who raises their hand. So we've kind of actually integrated our public input into the whole thing. So, but you're right. Yeah. We can do it in a more formalized manner in the future, definitely.
Okay, wonderful. And then any estimation of, this probably won't come to a surprise to Andrew, but will there be any revisions made to the exclusion zone during these task force?
Angela, we'll get around to that. I know that's your main concern and it's on the list of things to address, but yes.
Wonderful.
In fact, once we wrap up the early activation discussion, we can kind of go over a loose agenda and, you know, some things to expect in future meetings.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Looks like we're at Nara, and then I think that's Bart after that.
I just wanted to make sure that we're talking about dual licensing process and not eliminating the letter.
Right.
Yeah, I think we're recommending the letter.
Steering away from anything that creates a dual licensing issue.
Exactly.
But meaning dual licensing as multiple permits at the local level, not hindering simultaneous applications at both the local and the state level.
Okay.
All right, Bart?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you so much. This is Bart Levinson. My question has to do with, and excuse me, this might be partly my lack of understanding. Is cannabis being singled out for a unique treatment that wouldn't be allowed for other endeavors, say building a house? And from a public's point of view, it at times has seemed like cannabis has been getting special privileges and advanced privileges that would not have been consistent or allowed with other concerns. And I just wanted to voice that, that there's the appearance of that. Isn't it important to be consistent within the county?
Thanks, Bart.
Yeah.
What our purpose here today, we're working on recommendations because a certain portion of the Lake County zoning code has been found to be problematic, as opposed to our everyday important jobs of issuing building permits, which is partially reliant on our zoning ordinance, but that's just for development and design standards, but mostly refers to the state code, which we all stay current with. So I can understand that it seems like an awful lot of time is dedicated to cannabis, but I think it's because the Board of Supervisors really prioritize making updates. Let's see where their code is not working anymore, and let's just fix it so that we won't have this overwhelming amount of time dedicated to cannabis in the future. It'll just eventually become more like any other use permit that we process in the department.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, I think, some of the impression of the special treatment that cannabis has received is largely represented by this early activation issue. The fact that they can go ahead and be allowed to move forward when they haven't fully obtained their use permit. So that's very much a source of that impression. So, but other than that, in some ways you could also argue that cannabis is under much stricter, regulations than, say, traditional agriculture or something like that. So.
Do you think the day will ever come that it'll be considered agriculture? Because it seems to me like it should be agriculture.
As soon as it's federally recognized,
Yeah,
then it'll make it a lot easier.
Yeah,
So.
Without being federally recognized, a lot of the federal agricultural practices and stuff can't be applied at this point.
One thing that's happening at the state legislature level, that's totally not related, sorry, so I'm bird walking for a second, but there is legislation that would allow the governor to create or to go into agreements with other states, which would open up our cannabis market to multiple states. So we'll see where that goes. But there are continuous activities to try to sort of inch our way more towards acting like it's legal on the federal level. So, but there are, of course, large pitfalls for that as well. So, okay, so where we have it is the recommendation to remove early activation as it pertains to cannabis, and create a mechanism for a letter that would be acceptable to the state to allow for dual permit and license processing. We had brief discussion on removing the minor use permit as an alternative recommendation. Is that the consensus of the task force? If it is not, let me know. Raise your
My
hand.
understanding from the attorney, what was her name?
Nicole.
Nicole, was that it really is another one of those conundrums. It just creates a catch-22. So I don't think we should have a minor use permit in there. It just sets them up for possible failure.
Okay, Nara?
Yeah, if everyone is required to get a minor and a major use permit, then that's an issue with dual licensing. But there are some farms in the county that are smaller and smaller impact and might not require the same level of scrutiny, and so you wouldn't want to remove the ability for those small farms, which are often not as well capitalized, to be able to to say, hey, I'm 5,000 square feet, or I'm 10,000 square feet or less. I'm just or even people converting from higher higher water use ag things, to be able to make it easier for folks that are going to be smaller or less impactful.
So we wouldn't, we're not removing minor use permits as an option for cannabis growers.
Right,
We're just
right.
removing that as a possible solution for this particular issue.
Right.
That's my understanding. Are you cool with that one? Okay, okie doke. All right. Rubbing it out. All right. I think we have recommendations.
Okay, So we will follow up with that, and get that scheduled for the planning commission.
And in fact, I think by the time we get to the planning commission, we may be able to pull some of the other jurisdictional examples that were mentioned today and just have that available as well. Because the more data we can give the planning commission, the better off our overall recommendation will be to the board.
Sounds good to me.
Good. So what's next on our agenda?
Next, well, we were gonna get into housekeeping details and organizational norms, which kind of falls into the main focus of our next meeting, which is, which I have here listed as far as like a loose agenda of what to expect. So for our next meeting, before we move on into anything else, we need to establish some ground rules for how this task force is going to operate. You know, we can look into a code of conduct. We can look into decision-making processes and, you know, whether we're voting or we're deciding things as a consensus. We need to all come together and agree on all of those next. So our next meeting will be focused on the ground rules.
I'm thinking we kind of want our meetings to go kind of the way they went today, except we will add more formalized options for public input. That's a good one. That was a good suggestion.
Yep. Moving on from that, some things to think about that we will be considering. And so maybe now we can kind of plant the seed and let people start to kind of brainstorm and let it incubate over the next period of time. We'll be looking into determining a vision for cannabis in the county of Lake. Establishing that early on provides something that we can all fall back on as we move forward and we're debating different topics. We're like, how does this match to the vision that we've kind of established? Similar to when we're planning and we're looking at ordinances and, you know, a planner's review of that, sometimes it's not clear, so you fall back to the general plan for the county. So it will serve that purpose. Then we can look into deciding the appropriate format for the ordinance. There's a few drafts out there, but I think that they need to be reworked, and I think that's why this task force was formed. And then when we're drafting the actual ordinance itself, we will look into the purpose of the ordinance, which we can also kind of fall back on the vision for that. And for cannabis, the applicability of the use, the performance standards, the uses permitted, the things we do allow with our cannabis permits, uses prohibited, the things we do not, establishing and expanding upon exclusion zones, which is what Angela was concerned about. We'll have to touch upon development standards, development standard exceptions, application requirements, application processes, and then definitions. So, and this isn't exhaustive. There's going to be other issues that come up, but these are some of the key things that we need to incorporate into the new ordinance. So,
to help us come up to speed, or me come up to speed, because I've really been head in the sand when it comes to marijuana.
Sure.
Could you at our next meeting have a list of, like, not names, but how many active permits there or grows there are, what issues might have come up where we saw that maybe we put something in place that created a hardship, all that?
We have a lot of minutes here. We had some workshops, we had we had 2 days of workshops where, you know, the public came and the cannabis industry came. We can refer back to all of our annual inspections.
So I would like to be able to talk to legal, correct, proper growers and find out some of their thoughts. You know, what caused you to have horrible obstacles? What helped you the most? How would you see this? Just because I've never talked to a legal grower. I've seen plenty of illegal ones.
So those comments would have been included in one of the workshop nights, was focused just on cannabis. Could we have those available to us?
We're gonna be bringing all of those back. Our director has been overseeing those. She's out of town until, she's been out of town the past 2 weeks. Thursday she comes back. We'll have all of that prepared and we'll bring that to the next meeting so we can start considering all of those options.
You know what? Don't we have a link to the YouTube video?
I'm sure there is one
Why don't we
somewhere.
send that out before the next meeting so you can get caught up?
Yeah,
before
there
we
some
get here.
videos of the workshops and you can kind of get an idea of what was discussed. Let's see, what else is there?
Also, anyone who was joining us virtually today who's not on the task force, if you would like us to send out information, if you'd like to be added to our distribution list, we'd be happy to do that. Just go ahead and send an email to Andrew You want to spell your name for the email?
Yeah, it's Andrew Amelong, A-M as in mouse, E-L-U, N as in nose, G, at lakecountyca.gov.
There, we'll go ahead and get a distribution list up and running, so materials that we send out for the task force, you can get that as well.
And I guess,
We have Bart raising her hand.
okay.
Go ahead, Bart.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I heard Andrew talk about wanting to establish a vision and determine what that is. And I'd like to add to that what's needed is to incorporate a holistic vision for the whole county. How will the marijuana industry and the residential community and the existing business communities all come to a place where they can comfortably live with one another? That it isn't, I'd like to suggest that however much we'd like to see a shining future for the marijuana industry, isn't it true that we've come to this point today of having to form this task force because there have been bumps of how the industry is rubbing up in uncomfortable ways against the residential areas and other business areas within the county?
Thanks,
Yes.
Bart.
Yeah, that pretty much kind of sums up a big part of our job. So there is that. And let's see. Oh, also in terms of like further outreach, I know we have one guest speaker that will be coming. Patrick Sullivan from Tax Collection would like to attend one of these meetings and go over how the county brings in tax revenue from cannabis. And that's gone through a few changes recently. But aside from that, I'm also available to reach out and do, other interviews or other, basically reach out to different people. I'd like to incorporate some experts from the academic world. A lot of the University of California campuses have now cannabis research programs. We can learn a lot from the research that they're pulling. And I'd also like to get some input from the state, because the more we can mirror this ordinance with state regulations, the easier it is for everyone. We just customize for Lake County what, Lake County needs as needed. So, but if we can mirror those state regulations as much as possible, it makes everyone's life a little easier. So with that said, I guess that
Next meeting date?
Next meeting date. Let's discuss the next meeting date. Let's take a look at a calendar.
Did Robert happen to tell you what times and dates would work for him in advance?
Oh yeah, he didn't specify that. He's generally available. He was just out of town.
Oh, okay,
these last 2 days. I'm in pretty close contact with him. So, is there like a certain time of the week that kind of works for everybody? This past
How often do we want to meet?
and how often do we want to meet? I think the initial plan was to meet every other Wednesday afternoon, but I guess that's for us to determine. So if Wednesday afternoon might not be good for someone, or here we are on a Monday afternoon where most people were able to attend, perhaps every 2 weeks on Monday.
So we have 35 days to.
Well,
Actually, we just finished our 35-day
Yeah.
task.
Oh, that was it. Okay.
Yeah, the pressure's off.
We're not gonna mess around.
We
Yeah.
did that one recommendation, we're good.
yeah, so the next meeting is really where we jump into the work that, we're tasked with. So,
I guess to preface answering that question, what do you see the lifetime of this task force being? So long-term, how to fit this into our schedule?
I think ideally I've heard it floated that we'd like to come up with something by November,
Okay.
hopefully.
I
So,
know that the board will be looking forward to the recommendations from this task force. They would much prefer it to not just, meander along.
yeah,
So
That's-
if we can
sorry.
pursue it with all due diligence, that would be great.
If there's a chance to do earlier in the day, that would be ideal. I know I mentioned that earlier to you, Maria. So
Incredible.
just even that one. I have preschool pickup in Middletown at 3:30. So
So let's also keep these meetings at about 90 minutes max.
We could potentially look at 9 AM. That's when Board of Supervisor and Planning Commission meet. However, that would kind of rule out Tuesdays and Thursdays. So I think we might be limited to Monday, Wednesdays, or Fridays.
So are Mondays good for people in general?
Mondays are good.
Yeah?
Okay.
Okay, Nara, how early is good?
Preferably not.
I mean, not, yeah, at any time, if it starts,
I'd like to voice that mornings are extremely difficult for me
Okay.
work-wise, so if it's
Oh,
possible to
super.
do, I mean, I can shoot for earlier in the afternoon if that is more, you know,
If we do
preferable.
a 1, we'd be done by 2:30, is that?
that's
okay?
totally doable. That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah,
is-
Okay,
that's great for me. I just,
Cool.
mornings are very difficult.
Yeah,
I'll do
yeah.
it if it has to be done, but it's very difficult.
thank you. This is fine. So Mondays at 1.
Every other Monday, is that what we're gonna do?
We're doing every other
We'll
week?
look at every other week to keep us on track, and we can change that as needed as you know,
Good, I
as we
think
progress.
that's good.
So,
I think every week would be too much.
Yeah.
So the next one
Sometimes
will
we'll
be the
need turnaround
15th
time.
then?
it looks like it. I don't have a calendar in front of me, but, yeah, if today's the first, then that
Yeah.
would make sense.
You can send out an Outlook invite too.
Okay.
And that way they have a recurring meeting.
Yeah, we'll send that out. I'll send some material, this kind of loose timeline and things to cover. When my director gets back, I want to go over it and discuss it with her. She has some ideas and maybe some changes. That's why I'm not sending it out quite yet, but I give you a little preview.
And when you send that out too, could you maybe put like the topic of something of what we kind of need to focus on? So I mean, you gave us the whole laundry
Right,
list.
right.
but-
Yeah.
Yeah.
For the next
Yeah.
meeting, just start thinking about ground rules, and code of conduct and decision-making processes.
Sure.
So, you can do some research on that. As I look into different ideas, I might send those to you ahead of time so you can take a look at it before you come.
For
So
the next meeting, it might be good if Patrick can join us too.
that might
Let's
be a
get all
good time
the
for Patrick to
legal
come. Yeah.
Stuff
So we have-
done. Okay, so I think that concludes your meeting.
That concludes the meeting.
Super.
Meeting adjourned.
We're gonna go ahead and adjourn. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
You know, when I'm talking to people in other counties, Napa and Sonoma, they rave about Lake County and how fast we're